In the summer of 1883, Maybelle Crane dragged herself from her bed before dawn, her swollen belly making every movement a careful negotiation. The Kansas sun hadn't yet crested the horizon, but she knew it would show no mercy once it did. Her husband Thomas had been dead 6 months now, taken by fever, leaving behind debts that grew like weeds and a farm that demanded more than one pregnant woman could give. She pulled on her work dress, the fabric tight across her middle, and stepped onto the porch of their small cabin. The fields stretched before her, brown and stubborn, waiting for her hands to coax life from the reluctant earth. Each morning brought the same question: how long could she keep this up alone? But what Maybelle didn't know was that help was coming. In the form of a quiet cowboy whose own scars ran deeper than the furrows she plowed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Crane farm had seen better days, though Maybelle sometimes wondered if those days existed more in her memory than in reality. Thomas had always been optimistic about their 160 acres, speaking of rich soil and good water, as if hope alone could make crops flourish. Now, standing in the pale morning light, she could see the truth he'd tried so hard to paint over with dreams. The barn leaned to one side like an old man favoring a bad hip. Its red paint had faded to the color of dried blood, and several boards hung loose where the wind had worried them free. Inside, their last remaining cow, Bessie, lowed softly, reminding Maybelle that even the animals depended on her now. Thomas had sold off most of their livestock the year before he died, trying to keep up with the mortgage payments to the Farmers' Bank of Lawrence. She made her way to the well, each step deliberate and measured. The baby had dropped lower in recent weeks, making her waddle like the geese that used to visit their pond before it dried up last summer. The well still gave water, thank the Lord, though she had to work the pump handle with both hands now, her belly getting in the way of everything she tried to do. As she filled her wooden bucket, Maybelle let her gaze wander over the fields that had once held such promise. Thomas had planted corn here, wheat there, even tried his hand at sugar beets one ambitious spring. Now the land lay fallow, too much for one woman to manage, especially one carrying a child. Weeds had taken hold where crops should have grown, and the fence posts Thomas had set with such care tilted at odd angles like broken teeth. The morning air carried the scent of dust and dying grass, so different from the rich earth smell she remembered from their first spring here. Thomas had carried her over the threshold of their little cabin, both of them giddy with the possibility of building something lasting. He'd pointed to the horizon and talked about the children they'd raise here, the legacy they'd leave behind. That was before the bad harvests, before the bank notices started arriving with increasing frequency, before the fever took him just when she needed him most. She touched the simple gold band on her finger, Thomas's wedding ring now worn thin. From 6 years of marriage and 6 months of widowhood. Some nights she twisted it around and around, a nervous habit that had developed since his death. The ring had belonged to his father, and his father before that. Thomas had slipped it onto her finger during their simple ceremony, promising it would never leave her hand as long as she lived. Now it felt both like a comfort and a chain, binding her to a past that couldn't help her face an uncertain future. The crumpled farm deed lay on the kitchen table where she'd left it the night before, weighed down by her mother's Bible. The legal language was difficult to parse, but certain phrases jumped out at her like accusations. In default of payment, foreclosure proceedings, 30 days' notice. Mr. Henderson from the bank had delivered it personally, his face a mask of professional sympathy that fooled no one. He'd known Thomas since they were boys, had even stood as a witness at their wedding. But business was business, he'd explained, and the bank had obligations to its depositors. Maybelle poured herself a cup of yesterday's coffee, now cold and bitter, and sat heavily in the chair Thomas had made for her their first Christmas. Her back ached constantly now, and her ankles swelled by evening no matter how much she elevated her feet. Dr. Morrison had warned her about working too hard, but what choice did she have? The baby would come whether she was ready or not, whether she had a roof over her head or not, whether she could afford his services or not. She opened the deed again, though she'd memorized every crushing word. $247.38. That's what stood between her and losing everything Thomas had worked for, everything their child deserved to inherit. She had $17 hidden in the coffee tin, money she'd saved from selling eggs to Mrs. Patterson in town. At this rate, she'd need 14 lifetimes to pay what she owed. Outside, a meadowlark sang from the fence post, its cheerful trill a stark contrast to the weight in her chest. Thomas had loved that sound, used to say it was the voice of the prairie welcoming them home. Now it sounded like mockery, a reminder of all the mornings he wouldn't be there to hear it. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the baby shift and kick, and wondered what kind of world she was bringing this child into. Would there be a farm to inherit? Or would her son or daughter grow up hearing stories about the land there? Parents had lost. The sun climbed higher, painting the sky the color of ripe peaches, and Maybelle knew she couldn't sit here feeling sorry for herself much longer. There was work to be done, impossible as it seemed. She had to try, for Thomas, for the baby, for the stubborn part of herself that refused to give up, even when giving up seemed like the only sensible choice. The fever had come on a Tuesday in February, starting as nothing more than Thomas complaining of feeling poorly after morning chores. By Thursday, he was burning with heat that no amount of cool cloths could ease. By the following Tuesday, Maybelle was standing beside a fresh grave in the churchyard, her hand resting on a belly that had just begun to show. Dr. Morrison had done what he could, but winter fever was a cruel visitor on the Kansas plains, and it took whom it pleased. Thomas had fought it for 6 days, delirious with heat, calling out instructions for spring planting that would never come. In his clearer moments, he'd gripped her hand and made her promise to keep the farm, to raise their child on the land his sweat had blessed. It was a promise that felt heavier with each passing day. The tools in the barn told the story of Thomas's hopes better than any words could. His plow, crafted by the best smithy in Lawrence, sat unused since his death. The handles were worn smooth by his hands, shaped by years of pushing through resistant earth. Maybelle had tried to use it once, but even with Bessie hitched up, she couldn't manage the weight and leverage required. The plow now gathered dust and rust, a monument to capabilities she didn't possess. His scythe hung on its wooden pegs, the blade still sharp from his last careful honing. Thomas had taken pride in keeping his tools in perfect condition, claiming that a farmer was only as good as the edge on his blade. Maybelle ran her finger along the metal, careful not to cut herself, and wondered how long it would stay sharp without his careful attention. She'd watched him countless times, running the whetstone along the steel with practiced strokes, but watching and doing were different skills entirely. The hammer he'd used to repair fence posts lay exactly where he'd left it, beside a pile of nails he'd never had the chance to use. She picked it up, surprised as always by its weight. Thomas had swung it with such ease, driving posts deep into the reluctant ground. In her hands, it felt unwieldy and foreign, another reminder of how much she'd depended on his strength without realizing it. It was while standing in the barn, surrounded by tools she couldn't properly use, that she first heard the voices from the road. The Caldwell family was passing by in their wagon, heading to town for supplies, and their conversation carried clearly in the still morning air. "Shameful, really," Agnes Caldwell was saying to her husband. "A woman in her condition trying to work that land alone. Thomas would roll in his grave." "Maybe so," Earl replied, his voice lower but still audible. "But what's she supposed to do? Can't eat pride, and that baby won't raise itself. She should have gone to her sister in Missouri when she had the chance," Agnes continued, "before she started showing so much. Now who'd take her in? A pregnant widow with no skills beyond farm work." Their words stung because they held too much truth. Maybelle did have a sister in Missouri, Sarah, who'd written after Thomas's funeral, suggesting she come stay until the baby was born. But Sarah's letter had also mentioned how tight money was, how her husband's job at the mill wasn't as steady as they'd hoped. The invitation had been kind, but reluctant, the sort of charity that would turn bitter with time. The Caldwell's wagon rolled past without stopping. There was a time when neighbors would have pulled up to chat, when Agnes would have brought soup, and Earl would have offered to mend a fence or check on the livestock. But widowhood had made Maybelle something different in their eyes. Not quite a neighbor anymore, but not yet gone enough to ignore completely. She existed in an uncomfortable middle space, someone to discuss rather than someone to help. Thomas's family had made their feelings clear at the funeral. His parents were dead, but his brother Marcus and sister-in-law Vivian had pulled her aside after the service with poorly disguised urgency. They'd offered to buy the farm for what they called a fair price, which turned out to be roughly half what Thomas had paid for it. When she'd refused, Marcus had gotten that pinched look he wore when discussing money. "Be reasonable, Maybelle," he'd said. "You can't run a farm, especially not with a baby coming. We'd be doing you a favor, taking this burden off your hands." But it wasn't a burden to her, it was home. It was the place where Thomas had carried her over the threshold, where they'd planned to raise their children, where their child should grow up knowing the smell of fresh earth and the satisfaction of honest work. Marcus saw only dollars and cents, profit and loss. He couldn't understand that some things weren't for sale at any price. The town viewed her situation with a mixture of pity and judgment that she found almost unbearable. When she made her weekly trip for supplies, conversations stopped when she entered the general store, then resumed in hushed tones after she passed. She caught fragments. "Poor thing, pride goeth before a fall." What did she expect? The women clucked their tongues and shook their heads, but none offered practical help. The men tipped their hats politely but looked through her as if she were already gone. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, had cornered her after church the Sunday before, offering what she called sisterly advice, in a voice loud enough for half the congregation to hear. "My dear," she'd said, "surely you can see that holding onto that farm is pure stubbornness. You'd be much better off selling while you can still get something for it before—" She'd let the sentence hang, but her meaning was clear. Before. The bank foreclosed, and she got nothing at all. Even Reverend Walsh, kind as he was, had suggested she might find peace in accepting help from Thomas's family. "Sometimes," he'd said gently, "the Lord's plan requires us to set aside our pride and trust in his provision through others." But Maybelle wondered if the Lord's plan might include her fighting to keep what was rightfully hers, what was rightfully her child's. Standing in the barn now, holding Thomas's hammer, she felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on her like the August heat. They all wanted her to give up, to fade away quietly and let someone else worry about the farm. It would be easier, certainly. It would be the sensible thing to do. But as she set the hammer back in its place and walked toward the fields that stretched beyond the barn, Maybelle felt something stubborn and strong rising in her chest. Thomas had believed in this land, in their future here. Their child deserved the chance to make that choice for themselves, not to grow up hearing how their mother had simply given up when things got difficult. The sun was fully up now, promising another scorching day, and there was work to be done. Somehow, some way, she would find a path forward. She had to. In the quiet evening hours, when the day's heat had finally broken and the first crickets began their nightly chorus, Maybelle would sit in the rocking chair Thomas had crafted for her and place both hands on her swollen belly. The baby moved more at night, as if sensing the peace that came with darkness, and she would feel tiny fists and feet pressing against her ribs, eager for the world beyond her womb. She kept her Bible on the small table beside the chair, its leather, cover worn soft from years of use. Her mother had given it to her on her wedding day, and pressed between the pages of Ecclesiastes was a single pressed flower from her bridal bouquet. a wild prairie rose that Thomas had picked for her the morning of their wedding because they couldn't afford store-bought flowers. The delicate petals had turned brown with age, but they still held their shape, a fragile reminder of hope and new beginnings. Sometimes she would take the flower out and hold it up to the lamplight, remembering how Thomas had presented it to her with such ceremony, as if it were the finest hothouse bloom from back east. "It's perfect," she told him then, and meant it. The rose had been simple and honest, just like their love, just like the life they'd planned to build together on this stubborn Kansas soil. The baby kicked harder now, strong enough that she could see the movement through her dress. Dr. Morrison said that was a good sign, that the child was healthy and growing well, despite the difficult circumstances. She tried to eat enough for both of them, though food had become another source of worry. The garden Thomas had planted was producing some vegetables, but without his care, many of the plants were struggling. She'd managed to preserve what she could, filling mason jars with tomatoes and green beans, but winter would be lean. At night, in the privacy of her own thoughts, Maybelle allowed herself to imagine the child she carried. Would it be a boy with Thomas's gentle brown eyes and steady hands? A girl with his quiet wisdom and love of the land? She'd felt foolish at first talking to her belly, but now she found herself having long conversations with her unborn child, explaining the weight of legacy and the burden of dreams. "Your papa was a good man," she would whisper in the darkness. "He loved this land something fierce, and he would have loved you even more. He used to put his hand right here where you're kicking now, and he'd tell you stories about the crops we'd grow and the animals we'd raise. He wanted to teach you everything, how to read the weather, how to know when the soil was ready for planting, how to gentle a spooked horse with just your voice." The responsibility of raising a child alone pressed against her chest like a physical weight. How could she teach her son or daughter the things Thomas should have passed down? How could she show them the skills she didn't possess herself? The farm required knowledge that took years to accumulate, wisdom that came from watching seasons turn and learning from both success and failure. Her own father had been a shopkeeper in town, more comfortable with ledgers than livestock. He'd died when she was 15, leaving her mother to run the store with Maybelle's help until she married Thomas at 19. She knew how to keep accounts and measure dry goods, how to read people's needs and make them feel welcome in a place of business. But farming was different. It required an intimacy with the land that Thomas had tried to share, but she'd never fully absorbed. Still, watching him work had taught her more than she'd realized. She knew that corn needed to be knee-high by the 4th of July, that the smell of rain coming could save or ruin a harvest depending on the timing. She'd learned to read the signs that warned of hail or drought, to recognize the difference between good soil and poor by the way it felt in her hands. Maybe it wasn't enough to run a farm successfully, but it was something to build on. The baby would need more than farming knowledge, though. It would need to understand the value of hard work, the satisfaction that came from building something lasting with your own hands. It would need to know that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Most of all, it would need to feel loved and wanted, despite coming into a world that already seemed stacked against it. She thought often about names. Thomas had favored strong, simple names, Samuel for a boy, after his grandfather who'd homesteaded the original family land in Ohio, Mary for a girl, after his mother who died when he was 12. But Maybelle found herself drawn to names that meant hope, Gabriel, meaning God is my strength, or Grace, for the unmerited favor that had carried her this far. The child stirred again, and she smoothed her hand over her belly in the circular motion that seemed to calm both of them. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered. "Are you going to be the kind of person who fights for what matters? Are you going to help me keep your papa's dream alive?" As if in answer, the baby settled into a peaceful stillness, and Maybelle felt a moment of contentment despite her worries. This child would know love, whatever else happened. It would know the story of its father, would understand the sacrifice and struggle that had gone into keeping this small piece of Kansas in the family. And maybe, just maybe, it would grow up to appreciate the woman who'd refused to give up when giving up would have been easier. Outside, a barn owl called from somewhere near the creek bed, and Maybelle remembered how Thomas used to say that owls were a good omen, sign of wisdom watching over them. She chose to believe him still, chose to see the night sounds as encouragement rather than loneliness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new aches in her back, and new worries about money. But tonight, in the gentle darkness of her home, she was content to rock slowly back and forth, planning a future that might be different from what she and Thomas had imagined, but would be theirs nonetheless. The pressed rose caught the lamplight. As she closed the Bible, its fragile beauty a reminder that some things endured despite impossible odds. Perhaps her child would be like that flower, delicate but surprisingly strong, beautiful because it had learned to bloom wherever it was planted. The heat of that Tuesday afternoon in mid-August was the kind that made the air shimmer like water. Above the baked earth, Maybelle had been working in what remained of the vegetable garden, trying to salvage the tomatoes before they split from the drought, when she felt the familiar tightening across her lower back that meant she'd pushed herself too far again. At 7 months along, her body had its own opinions about what constituted reasonable work, opinions that didn't align with the demands of keeping a farm running. She straightened slowly, one hand pressed to the small of her back, the other shading her eyes as she gazed across the brown expanse of her fields. The corn that should have been shoulder high was stunted and yellowing, the leaves curled tight against the relentless sun. Without Thomas's careful irrigation and his knowledge of when to plant for the best chance of catching the spring rains, her crops were failing as surely as everything else seemed to be. It was then that she saw him, a dark figure on horseback, emerging from the heat waves like something conjured from her desperate prayers. At first, she thought it might be a mirage, the kind of cruel trick the prairie played on weary eyes during the worst heat of summer. But as the rider drew closer, she could make out details that convinced her he was real. The easy way he sat, his horse, the quality of his mount's tack, the deliberate pace that spoke of a man comfortable with covering long distances. He was still too far away to make out his features clearly, but something about his bearing suggested authority, perhaps even wealth. His horse was a fine bay gelding, well fed and groomed, not the kind of animal a drifter or common cowhand would possess. As he approached, she noticed the quality of his leather gloves, supple and expensive-looking, a stark contrast to her own. Work-roughened hands, Maybelle wiped her palms on her apron, suddenly conscious of how she must look, hair escaping from its pins, dress stained with soil and sweat, her condition obvious to anyone with eyes. She considered retreating to the house, but something in the stranger's measured approach suggested he'd already seen her. Running would only make her appear more foolish than she already felt. The rider drew rein about 20 feet from where she stood, close enough for conversation, but far enough away to be respectful. When he touched the brim of his hat, she could see his face clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of years spent outdoors, but there was a refinement to him that suggested education and prosperity. His eyes were grey as storm clouds, and when they met hers, she felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, though she was certain she'd never seen him before. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying easily across the space between them. It was a deep voice, measured and careful, with just a hint of an accent she couldn't quite place. "I'm Harlan Boone. I own the Double B Ranch, about 15 miles north of here." She knew the name, of course. Everyone in the county knew about Harlan Boone and his vast spread of grassland where he raised some of the finest horses in Kansas. Thomas had spoken of him with the kind of admiration one successful man holds for another, though they'd never met. The Double B was the kind of operation farmers dreamed of building, prosperous, well-managed, and respected throughout the territory. "Mrs. Crane," she replied, pleased that her voice came out steadier than she felt. Maybelle Crane. He nodded, as if the name meant something to him, though she couldn't imagine how. I knew your husband by reputation, he said quietly. I was sorry to hear of his passing. Thomas Crane was spoken of as an honest man and a good farmer. The simple acknowledgement of Thomas's worth hit her harder than she'd expected. It had been weeks since anyone had spoken of her husband with respect rather than pity, and she found herself blinking back sudden tears. Thank you, she managed. That's kind of you to say. Harlan's gaze moved past her to take in the struggling garden, the failing crops, the general air of a farm slowly losing its battle against circumstance. When his eyes returned to her, there was no judgment in them, only a careful assessment that made her feel oddly seen rather than inspected. I was passing through on my way back from Lawrence, he said, and I couldn't help but notice you could use some assistance. The offer, however kindly meant, stiffened her spine. She'd heard too many versions of that sentiment lately, all leading to suggestions that she abandon everything Thomas had worked for. I appreciate the concern, Mr. Boone, but I'm managing. Fine. Even as the words left her mouth, she knew how hollow they sounded. The evidence of her struggle was written across every acre of the farm, visible in every wilted plant and broken fence rail. But admitting weakness to a stranger, even one who seemed genuinely kind, felt like betraying not just herself, but Thomas's memory. Harlan studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable sensation that he could see right through her. Pretense. When he spoke again, his tone was carefully neutral. I'm sure you are. But I noticed your east pasture fence has some posts that look like they might benefit from attention before winter, and that pump handle seems to be giving you trouble. She glanced involuntarily toward the well, where the handle had indeed been. Sticking for weeks, making the simple task of drawing water an ordeal that left her arms aching. How had he noticed such a small detail from horseback? I have men who are skilled with that sort of repair, he continued. Good men who could use the extra work, and it wouldn't cost you anything. Consider it a neighborly gesture. The word neighborly hung in the air between them, laden with implications. Neighbors helped each other, but they also expected things in return: loyalty, reciprocity, a certain level of social obligation. Maybelle had learned to be suspicious of generosity that came without clear conditions. Why? She asked bluntly. You don't know me, Mr. Boone. Why would you offer help to a stranger? For the first time since he'd arrived, something shifted in his expression. A shadow that crossed his features like a cloud passing over the sun. Let's just say I understand what it's like to face more than one person should have to handle alone. There was pain in those words, carefully contained but unmistakable. Whatever prosperity and success Harlan Boone had achieved, it hadn't come without cost. The recognition of shared loss created an unexpected moment of connection between them. Two people who'd learned that life could strip away everything you thought was permanent. Still, accepting help felt dangerous, like stepping onto ice that might not hold her weight. I appreciate the offer, she said carefully, but I've found that charity often comes with strings attached, whether they're mentioned up front or not. Not charity, he corrected gently. Neighborliness. There's a difference. He gathered his reins, preparing to leave, but paused as if struck by a thought. I'll tell you what, Mrs. Crane, I'll have my foreman, Jake, stop by tomorrow morning with a couple of men. If you decide you want the help, you can accept it. If not, they'll tip their hats and ride on. No obligation either way. Before she could respond, he touched his hat brim again and turned his horse toward the road. She watched him ride away, noting the easy confidence with which he handled his mount, the way he seemed to belong in the saddle as naturally as she belonged in her kitchen. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the afternoon heat, Maybelle stood, alone, in her failing garden, one hand pressed to her belly where the baby had begun to stir. The encounter had lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but something fundamental had shifted in the careful isolation she'd built around herself since Thomas's death. Help was coming, whether she wanted it or not. The question was whether she had the courage to accept it or the strength to send it away. Maybelle slept poorly that night, tossing restlessly in the bed she'd shared with Thomas, her mind replaying every word of her encounter with Harlan Boone. The baby seemed to sense her agitation, shifting and kicking until she finally gave up on sleep and made her way to the kitchen as the first pale light crept across the horizon. She was standing at the window, watching the sunrise paint the fields gold, when she saw them coming. 3 riders approaching at an unhurried pace, their horses stepping carefully through the morning mist that clung to the low places. Even at a distance, she could tell these weren't ordinary drifters. Their mounts were well cared for, their posture in the saddle spoke of experience, and they rode with the kind of purposeful direction that suggested they knew exactly where. And they were going. The lead rider was a man of perhaps 50, lean and weathered, with the easy authority of someone accustomed to managing both men and animals. He wore a battered hat that had seen many seasons, and his clothes, while clean and mended, showed the honest wear of hard work. Behind him rode 2 younger men, probably in their 20s, both carrying themselves with the alert readiness of experienced ranch hands. They drew rein in her yard with a courtesy that impressed her, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough from the house to avoid seeming threatening. The older man touched his hat brim and smiled, the kind of genuine expression that reached his eyes and made the deep lines around them more pronounced. "Morning, ma'am," he called out. "I'm Jake Morrison, foreman for Mr. Boone at the Double B. These are my boys, Pete and Charlie. Mr. Boone said you could use some help with a few repairs around the place." Maybelle stepped onto the porch, acutely aware of how she must appear in her faded house dress, her hair hastily pinned up but already escaping in the humidity. The baby had dropped lower in recent days, changing her center of gravity and making her movements more awkward. She felt ungainly and vulnerable under the polite assessment of 3 skilled men. "Mr. Morrison," she replied, pleased that her voice carried steadily across the distance between them. "Your employer mentioned he might send someone around." Jake nodded toward the well, where the stubborn pump handle had defeated her efforts again that morning. "That pump giving you trouble? Charlie here's got a gift with mechanical things. Bet he could have it working smooth as silk in no time." The younger man he'd indicated, Charlie, had sandy hair and gentle eyes, the kind of face that suggested he smiled easily. He raised his hand in a small wave, his expression earnest and respectful. "Ma'am, I'd be happy to take a look at that pump if you'd like. Won't take but a few minutes to see what's causing the trouble." Before Maybelle could respond, Jake continued, "And Pete's got an eye for fence work. Noticed some posts that look like they might need attention before the weather turns." Pete was darker than his companion, with the kind of deep tan that spoke of years spent outdoors. He nodded respectfully, but didn't speak, letting his foreman handle the negotiations. There was something solid and dependable about him, the quality of a man who took pride in work well done. Maybelle found herself in an impossible position. Every practical bone in her body screamed that she needed this help desperately. The pump had been getting worse daily, and she'd noticed the fence posts leaning more each time the wind picked up. Winter would test every weakness in the farms. Defenses, and what failed now would cost far more to repair later, but accepting help felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that Thomas had been wrong to believe she could manage on her own. It felt like the first step down a path that would end with her losing everything he'd worked to build. "I appreciate Mr. Boone's kindness," she said carefully, "but I'm not sure I can afford to pay for repairs right now." Jake's expression didn't change, but something in his posture relaxed slightly, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this concern. "Ma'am, Mr. Boone was real clear about that. He said this was neighborly help, not hired work. No payment expected or wanted." The words hung in the morning air, loaded with implications she wasn't sure she understood. Men like Harlan Boone didn't become successful by giving away their time and resources without reason. There had to be something he wanted in return. Some angle she wasn't seeing. Why, she asked bluntly, the same question she'd posed to Boone himself. Your employer doesn't know me from Adam. Why would he send 3 skilled men to work for free on a stranger's farm? Jake studied her for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years and experience. Ma'am, I've worked for Harlan Boone for 15 years, and I've learned a few things about him in that time. He's not a man who acts without good reason, but he's also not a man who explains himself over much. What I can tell you is this. He's got a keen eye for people who are fighting against long odds, and he respects folks who don't give up easy. He paused, glancing around the farm with the professional assessment of someone who understood both land and livestock. You're doing your best with a hard situation, Mrs. Crane. That's plain to see. And sometimes, when good people are struggling through no fault of their own, helping out is just the right thing to do. Charlie shifted in his saddle, and the leather creaked softly in the morning stillness. Begging your pardon, ma'am, he said respectfully, but that pump's going to fail completely if it's not seen too soon. Won't take me but an hour to get it working proper, and I've got all the parts we'd need right here in my saddlebags. As if, to underscore his point, the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly emphatic kick, reminding Maybelle of the approaching reality of childbirth and all the water she'd need for washing and cooking. She pressed her hand to her side where the baby's foot had connected with her ribs, and caught Jake watching her with the kind of paternal concern that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. I tell you what, Jake said quietly, why don't we just fix that pump and check those fence posts? If it makes you feel better about it, you can consider it payment on account. Someday, when you're better situated, maybe you can return the favor to someone else who needs a helping hand. The suggestion was so reasonable, so carefully crafted to preserve her dignity while offering the help she desperately needed, that Maybelle felt her resistance crumbling. In her apron pocket, she carried a small leather pouch that had arrived. That morning with one of Harlan's men, the finest vegetable seeds she'd ever seen, varieties she'd only heard about but never been able to afford. The gesture had been so quietly thoughtful that it had left her speechless. She looked at the 3 men waiting patiently for her decision, their faces showing nothing but respectful attention. They weren't judging her condition or her circumstances. They weren't offering charity wrapped in pity. They were simply offering to help because their employer had asked them to, and because they were the kind of men who took pride in work well done. All right, she said finally, the words coming out in a rush before she could change her mind. All right, if you're certain it's no trouble, I'd be grateful for the help. Jake's smile was genuine and warm. No trouble at all, ma'am. Charlie, why don't you start with that pump? Pete, let's take a look at those fence posts. Mrs. Crane, you just go about your business. We'll try to stay out of your way while we work. As the men dismounted and began unloading tools from their saddlebags, Maybelle retreated to the house, her heart beating faster than the baby's movements could account for. She'd crossed some invisible line by accepting help, stepped into territory she didn't fully understand. But as she watched Charlie examine the pump with the focused attention of a skilled craftsman, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope that things might actually get better instead of steadily worse. From her kitchen window, she could see the quality seeds in their small cloth bag sitting on her table like a promise of better harvests to come. Whatever Harlan Boone's motives, his gift of seeds and skilled labor was already changing her world in ways she was only beginning to understand. By midday, the transformation was remarkable. Charlie had not only repaired the pump, but somehow coaxed it into working better than it had since Thomas's death. The handle moved smoothly now, drawing water with an ease that made Maybelle realize just how much daily struggle she'd been accepting as normal. Pete had reset 4 fence posts and replaced 2 sections of rail. his work so neat and professional that it made the rest of the property look shabby by comparison. Jake had spent the morning walking the property with the careful eye of an experienced ranch manager, noting problems Maybelle hadn't even recognized. When he approached the house near noon, his hat in his hands and his expression respectfully serious, she knew he'd found more issues than could be addressed in a single morning. "Mrs. Crane," he said when she stepped onto the porch, "I hope you don't mind my speaking plainly. This is good land, and your husband clearly knew what he was about when he chose it. But there's work that needs doing before winter, work that's beyond what one person can manage alone." She'd been expecting this conversation, dreading it since she'd first agreed to let them help. The inevitable moment when kindness would transform into obligation, when the true cost of charity would be revealed. She braced herself for whatever terms would follow. "What kind of work?" she asked, keeping her voice level despite the anxiety building in her chest. Jake glanced toward the barn, where the sagging roofline was visible even from the house. "Your barn needs attention before heavy snow. That roof won't hold much weight as it stands now, and your winter feed situation." He paused diplomatically. "Well, you'll need hay and grain for your livestock, and from what I can see, there's not much stored up." The harsh reality of her situation, laid out so matter-of-factly, made her stomach clench. She'd been so focused on day-to-day survival that she'd barely considered the approaching winter. Thomas had always handled the seasonal preparations, laying in hay and grain, checking the roof and foundation, ensuring their animals would survive the harsh Kansas cold. "I see," she said quietly, though she didn't see how any of it could be. Resolved without money, she didn't have. Jake must have read something in her expression because his tone gentled. "Ma'am, I don't mean to worry you unnecessarily. Mr. Boone mentioned he's got surplus hay this year, and he'd be willing to share it, rather than see good animals suffer. And the barn roof, well, Pete's father was a carpenter before he took to ranching. He could shore up those beams and patch the worst spots." Another gift, another inexplicable kindness from a man she'd met exactly once. Maybelle felt the weight of accumulating debt, not the monetary kind, but the more dangerous emotional obligation that came with accepting help from someone whose motives remained mysterious. "Mr. Morrison," she said carefully, "please understand that I'm grateful for everything Mr. Boone has offered, but I have to ask, what does he expect in return? Men don't become successful by giving away their resources without reason." Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon where heat waves still shimmered despite the approaching autumn. When he looked back at her, his expression was thoughtful, almost sad. "Ma'am, there are things about Mr. Boone that aren't mine to tell, but I will say this. He understands loss in ways that most folks don't, and he's learned that sometimes the only way to make sense of what you've been through is to help others who are facing their own hard times." Before she could ask what he meant, Charlie called out from near the barn where he'd been examining the structure Jake had mentioned. "Mrs. Crane, ma'am, you might want to come see this." They walked over together, Maybelle moving carefully on the uneven ground, her balance affected by the baby's changing position. Charlie was kneeling beside what looked like a wooden crate, partially hidden by the tall grass that had grown up around the barn's foundation. "Found this tucked away back here," he said, brushing dirt and grass away from the carved surface. "Looks like it's been here a while, but it's good craftsmanship, cedar by the look of it." As the details became clear, Maybelle's breath caught in her throat. It was a cradle, hand-carved with intricate patterns along the sides, the wood aged to a warm honey color, but still sound and beautiful. Along the headboard, carved in Thomas's careful script, were the words, "For our children, with love and hope." She knelt beside it, ignoring the protest from her back and the awkwardness of her condition, running her fingers over the smooth wood that Thomas had shaped with such love and anticipation. She remembered now, he'd worked on it during the long winter evenings of their first year of marriage, whittling and sanding by lamplight, planning for the children they'd hoped to have. When months passed without pregnancy, he'd quietly stored it away, too painful a reminder of unfulfilled dreams. He made this, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Thomas made this for our babies. Jake and Charlie exchanged glances, both understanding immediately the significance of the discovery. Pete had joined them, and all three men stood, respectfully silent, as Maybelle traced the carved patterns with trembling fingers. "It's beautiful work," Jake said quietly. "He was a man of many talents, your husband." The cradle was more than furniture. It was Thomas's faith in their future made manifest, his belief that their love would create life and legacy. Finding it now, when she most needed tangible proof of his dreams, felt like a message from beyond. The grave. The baby moved within her as if responding to the sight of its intended resting place, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Maybelle felt truly connected to the child she carried. "We could clean it up for you," Charlie offered, gently. "Oil the wood, make sure the joints are tight, it's good work, built to last generations." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and slowly rose with Jake's respectful assistance. The cradle would need to be moved inside, cleaned and prepared, made ready for the child who would soon need it. But more than that, it represented continuity, the unbroken thread connecting Thomas's hopes to her reality. As they carried the cradle toward the house, Maybelle caught sight of a rider approaching in the distance. Even at a considerable distance, she recognized the easy seat and purposeful pace that marked Harlan Boone. Her heart began to beat faster, though whether from anxiety or anticipation, she couldn't say. Jake noticed her attention and followed. Her gaze. "That'll be Mr. Boone, checking on our progress," he said matter-of-factly. "He likes to see things through personally when he sets his mind to helping someone." The other men continued with their work, but Maybelle found herself smoothing her hair and checking her appearance in a way that seemed foolish given her condition and circumstances. There was something about Harlan Boone that made her conscious of herself as a woman, rather than simply a widow struggling to survive. As he drew closer, she could see that he carried himself with the same quiet authority that had impressed her during their first meeting. Whatever brought him back to her farm, she suspected it would change things between them in ways she wasn't prepared to understand. The cradle sat on her porch now, Thomas's love made visible in honey-colored wood, waiting for the child who would represent both past and future. And approaching across the summer-brown fields came the man whose mysterious kindness was slowly transforming her world, one careful gesture at a time. Harlan Boone dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than on foot, his boots hitting the ground with barely a sound. Up close, Maybelle could see the fine quality of everything he wore, the hand-tooled leather of his belt, the careful stitching of his shirt, the silver inlay on his spurs that caught the afternoon light. Yet nothing about him seemed ostentatious or showy. His wealth was evident in the quality of details rather than flashy display. "Mrs. Crane," he said, touching his hat brim in that respectful gesture she was beginning to recognize as habitual. "I hope my men haven't been too much trouble." "No trouble at all," she replied, glancing toward where Charlie was putting finishing touches on the pump mechanism. "They've been more help than I can properly express." Jake approached from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd diagnosed problems that could be solved. "Mr. Boone, we've got the immediate concerns handled. Pumps working smooth as silk now, and Pete's shored up the worst of the fence issues. But that barn roof's gonna need attention before the first heavy snow." Harlan nodded, his grey eyes moving over the property with the same careful assessment she'd noticed during his first visit. There was something almost protective in the way he surveyed her land, as if he were taking inventory of threats and vulnerabilities that might need addressing. "What about feed for the livestock?" he asked Jake, though his attention remained fixed on the barn's sagging roofline. "That's the bigger concern," Jake admitted. "Not much hay put by, and winter feed's going to be scarce this year, with the drought hitting so many farms." Maybelle felt heat rise in her cheeks at this casual discussion of her inadequacies, even Though both men spoke without judgment, the truth was she'd been so focused on immediate survival that she'd barely considered the approaching winter's demands. Thomas had always handled the seasonal preparations with a foresight she was only now beginning to appreciate. "I have hay," Harlan said simply, "more than my stock will need, and Pete's father could handle the roof work if Mrs. Crane is agreeable." There it was again, another offer of help that she couldn't afford to refuse, but couldn't understand either. Maybelle found herself studying Harlan's profile as he continued to examine her property, looking for clues to explain his inexplicable generosity. His face was weathered but strong, with the kind of lines that suggested both outdoor work and thoughtful consideration. There was something in his expression when he thought no one was watching, a shadow of old pain that made her wonder what losses had shaped him. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I need to ask you something directly." He turned to face her fully, his grey eyes meeting hers with an openness that was both encouraging and intimidating. "Of course. Why are you doing this? All of this help, the seeds, the repairs. What do you want from me?" For a moment, the only sounds were the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the dry grass. Jake had moved tactfully away, busying himself with checking Pete's fence work, but she sensed he was listening. When Harlan spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "5 years ago, I lost my wife to childbed fever. The baby died with her." The words came out flat and matter-of-fact, but she could hear the carefully controlled pain beneath them. "I had all the money in the world to hire the best doctors, the finest care, and it didn't matter. Sometimes life takes what it wants, regardless of how much you have or how hard you fight." He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to his vest pocket where she caught the glint of a watch chain. "After Catherine died, I spent a long time thinking the world was nothing but taking and losing. Then I started noticing people who kept fighting even when they had every reason to give up. People like you." The comparison made her uncomfortable. "I'm not fighting, Mr. Boone. I'm barely surviving." "Same thing sometimes," he said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're 7 months pregnant, working land that would challenge an experienced farmer, and you haven't given up. That takes a kind of courage that money can't buy." Maybelle felt the baby shift within her, a reminder of the life she was indeed fighting to protect. "I don't have much choice." "There's always a choice," Harlan said gently. "You could have sold to your husband's family, moved to your sister's, accepted any number of easier paths. But you're here, trying to build something for that child you're carrying. That's worth respecting." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a gold pocket watch, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. For a moment, he stared at it, as if seeing something beyond the present moment. "Catherine used to say that the best way to honor what you've lost is to help preserve what others are trying to build." The watch was clearly expensive, probably custom-made, and she could see an inscription on the back, though she couldn't make out the words. Whatever was written there seemed to cause him pain, but also resolve. "I'm not trying to save you, Mrs. Crane," he continued, closing the watch and returning it to his pocket. "I'm not trying to take your husband's place or make you dependent on my charity. I'm simply offering the kind of help I wish someone had offered Catherine and me when we were starting out, before we learned how quickly everything can change." His honesty was both disarming and overwhelming. She could see the sincerity in his expression, the careful way he held himself as if afraid of presuming too much. Here was a man who understood loss in ways that most people never would, who had found a way to transform his grief into something useful rather than bitter. "I don't know how to repay such kindness," she said quietly. "I'm not asking for repayment," he replied. "But if you want to give me something in return, don't give up. Keep fighting for what your husband built, for what your child deserves. Sometimes the best thing we can do with help is to use it well." The baby kicked strongly then, as if responding to the conversation, and Maybelle pressed her hand to the spot where the movement was strongest. "I'll try," she said, and meant it. "That's all anyone can do," Harlan said. He glanced toward the cradle sitting on her porch, and something in his expression softened. "That's beautiful work. Your husband was a craftsman. He made it during our first year of marriage," she explained. "We found it today, stored away behind the barn. I'd almost forgotten it existed." "He believed in the future," Harlan observed, "in children who would come to fill it. That's a powerful kind of faith." As he prepared to mount his horse, Maybelle felt an unexpected reluctance to see him go. His presence had brought a sense of stability to her chaotic world, a feeling that someone capable and experienced was paying attention to her struggles. It was dangerous to grow dependent on such comfort, but she found herself hoping he would. "Return. My men will be back tomorrow to start on the barn roof," he said, settling into his saddle with practiced ease. "And I'll have some hay delivered before the week's out. Good hay, properly cured." He touched his hat brim one final time and turned his horse toward the road. As she watched him ride away, Maybelle touched the pocket watch's outline against her belly where the baby rested, thinking about the inscription she hadn't been able to read and the wife whose memory still shaped his actions, whatever was growing. Between them, it was built on mutual understanding of loss and respect for the courage required to keep building despite it. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt that someone truly saw her, not as an object of pity or charity, but as a woman worthy of partnership in the difficult work of living. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a stern-faced clerk from the Farmers' Bank of Lawrence, whose horse kicked up dust clouds that settled on everything like a shroud. Maybelle had been hanging laundry on the line behind the house, moving slowly in the heavy air that promised afternoon thunderstorms when she heard the approaching hoofbeats. The man dismounted with officious precision, consulting a leather portfolio. Before approaching the house, he was young, perhaps 25, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent his days indoors, tallying figures rather than working under the Kansas sun. His clothes were city-made and impractical for rural travel, already showing dust and wrinkles from the ride. "Mrs. Thomas Crane?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Yes," Maybelle replied, wiping her damp hands on her apron and trying to ignore the way her heart had begun to race. Official visits never brought good news. "Samuel Hartwell, representing the Farmers' Bank of Lawrence," he announced, extracting a folded document from his portfolio with the flourish of someone who enjoyed the authority his position granted. "I have here a final notice of foreclosure. Proceedings. You have 10 days to settle your account in full, or the bank will be forced to seize this property to satisfy the debt." The world seemed to tilt slightly as she accepted the document with hands that trembled despite her efforts to remain composed. 10 days. Not the 30 she'd been counting on, not the month she'd hoped to use for finding some solution. 10 days to produce nearly $250 or lose everything Thomas had worked to build. "There must be some mistake," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew there was no mistake. Banks didn't make errors in their favor. The previous notice said 30 days. Hartwell consulted his portfolio again, his manner suggesting he found her confusion tiresome. "The original notice was dated 6 weeks ago, Mrs. Crane. Subsequent communications have received no response, and no payments have been made toward the outstanding balance. This constitutes final notice. 6 weeks ago, she'd been so overwhelmed with Thomas's death and her advancing pregnancy that she'd barely managed to keep track of days, let alone legal deadlines. She remembered receiving papers from the bank, but they'd seemed like distant threats compared to the immediate challenges of survival. Now those distant threats had become crushing reality. "I understand this is difficult," Hartwell continued, with perfunctory sympathy, "but the bank has obligations to its depositors. We've extended considerable patience given your circumstances, but business is business." After he left, trailing dust and legal certainty behind him, Maybelle sat at her kitchen table with the foreclosure notice spread before her like a death warrant. The language was formal and merciless. Failure to cure default, accelerated payment schedule, sheriff's sale. Words that reduced Thomas's dreams and her child's inheritance to a legal proceeding. She was still sitting there when Harlan's men arrived to continue work on the barn roof. Through the window, she watched them unload materials and tools with the efficient teamwork of experienced craftsmen and felt a crushing weight of guilt. Here were good men working without pay to help her keep a farm she was about to lose anyway. Their kindness would be wasted, their efforts meaningless. Jake knocked on the door frame, his hat in his hands and concern written across his weathered features. "Mrs. Crane, everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." The question broke something loose inside her, and before she could stop herself, the whole story came tumbling out. The bank notice, the impossible deadline, the certainty that everything was lost. Jake listened without interruption, his face growing more serious with each detail. 10 days, he repeated when she finished. That's not much time to work with. "There's no point in working with it," Maybelle said, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. "I don't have $250. I don't have $50. I barely have enough to last the week." Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying the legal document with the careful attention of a man who'd seen his share of hard times. "Mrs. Crane, would you mind if I showed this to Mr. Boone? He might have some ideas about how to handle the situation." The suggestion made her stomach clench with shame. Bad enough that she'd accepted Harlan's charity when she thought she had a chance of making the farm work. Now he'd learn that his kindness had been wasted on a lost cause, that she was just another failed farmer who couldn't make the hard choices necessary for survival. "I can't ask him to solve my problems," she said quietly. "He's done enough already." "You're not asking," Jake pointed out gently. "I'm suggesting. And Mr. Boone, well, he's got experience with banks and legal matters that might be useful. Couldn't hurt to get his opinion." Before she could object further, Pete appeared in the doorway, his expression urgent. "Jake, you need to come see this. Found something odd while we were pulling up the loose boards on the roof." They followed him to the barn, where Charlie was kneeling beside a wooden beam, examining something that glinted in the filtered light. As they drew closer, Maybelle could see it was a small metal box, tarnished with age but still intact, wedged into a gap between two support timbers. "Looks like it's been there for years," Charlie said, carefully working the box free from its hiding place. "Hidden real deliberate-like, not just stuck there by accident." The box was heavier than its size suggested, and when Jake pried it open, with his pocket knife, they all stared in surprise at the contents. Gold coins, 20 of them, nestled in faded velvet like sleeping secrets. American eagles, each one worth more than Maybelle had seen in months. "Thomas," she whispered, understanding immediately. This was his emergency fund, the nest egg he'd hidden away for the kind of disaster that had actually come to pass. He'd never told her about it, probably hoping he'd never need to reveal its existence. The hiding place would have gone with him to the grave if Pete hadn't needed to replace that particular roof beam. Jake whistled low under his breath. "That's a fair amount of money, Mrs. Crane. Might not cover everything you owe, but it's a good start." Maybelle lifted one of the coins, feeling its solid weight in her palm. 20 eagles at $20 each made $400, more than enough to satisfy the bank and leave something over for winter preparations. Thomas had been planning for their future, even in ways she'd never known about. But as relief flooded through her, it was followed immediately by a more complex emotion. The money solved her immediate crisis, but it also changed the nature of her relationship with Harlan Boone. She'd been accepting his help as someone with no other options, someone deserving of charity. Now she had resources of her own, which meant his continued involvement would be based on different motivations entirely. "We need to tell Mr. Boone about this," Jake said, echoing her thoughts. "He'll want to know the situation's changed." As Charlie carefully returned the coins to their box, Maybelle felt the baby stir restlessly within her. Everything was changing again, just when she'd begun to understand the shape of her circumstances. She had money now, independence, the ability to stand on her own feet without relying on anyone's charity. So why did the prospect of no longer needing Harlan's help feel more like loss than victory? The legal notice still lay on her kitchen table, but it no longer seemed like a death sentence. Thomas had provided for this moment even when he couldn't provide for anything else. The question now was what she would do with the choices his foresight had given her, and whether those choices would include the quiet man whose kindness had begun to matter more than she cared to admit. Harlan arrived within an hour of Jake sending word, riding hard enough that his horse's flanks showed sweat despite the cooling afternoon air. Maybelle watched him approach from her kitchen window, noting the tension in his posture that suggested he'd feared the worst when summoned urgently. The sight of him spurring his mount toward her farm with such obvious concern stirred something warm and complicated in her chest. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, ground-tying the animal with the efficiency of long practice. Jake met him near the barn, and she could see them talking in low, urgent voices, Jake's gestures indicating both the roofwork and the house. After a few moments, both men looked toward the kitchen window, where she stood watching, and Harlan's expression shifted from concern to something she couldn't quite identify. When he knocked on her doorframe, she was struck again by his natural courtesy. Despite his obvious anxiety about the situation, he waited for her invitation rather than simply entering. His grey eyes searched her face as if looking for signs of distress or defeat. "Mrs. Crane," he said quietly, "Jake told me about the bank. Notice, I'm sorry you're facing such pressure." She gestured toward the table where the foreclosure document lay beside the wooden box containing Thomas's hidden gold. "It seems my husband was more prepared than either of us knew." Harlan approached slowly, his attention fixed on the open box and its gleaming contents. When he looked up at her, his expression was carefully neutral, but she thought she detected something like disappointment in his eyes before he shuttered it away. 20 eagles, he said, his voice professionally calm. "That should more than cover what you owe the bank." $400, she confirmed, enough to pay the debt and have something left for winter preparations. Thomas hid it in the barn rafters. Pete found it when they were working on the roof. They stood on opposite sides of the table, the gold coins between them like a barrier. The discovery that had seemed like salvation an hour ago now felt awkward, changing the careful balance they'd established. She was no longer the desperate widow accepting charity from a wealthy rancher. She was a woman with resources of her own, which made every interaction more complex. "I suppose this changes things," she said, voicing what they were both thinking. Harlan was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently against his hat brim. When he spoke, his words came carefully, as if he were navigating unfamiliar territory. "Does it? Change things, I mean." The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither seemed ready to explore fully. Maybelle found herself studying his face, looking for clues to what he was really asking. Did he want it to change things? Was his help contingent on her need or based on something deeper? "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I accepted your help because I had no other choice. Now I have choices again. And does having choices mean you no longer want help?" His voice remained even, but she caught the slight tension in his jaw that suggested the question mattered more than he was letting on. Before she could answer, the baby delivered a particularly strong kick that made her gasp and press her hand to her side. The movement was so sudden and forceful that it served as a reminder of the larger reality. Regardless of hidden gold or bank debts, she was still a pregnant woman facing childbirth and child-rearing alone on an isolated farm. "I'm sorry," she said, catching her breath. "The baby seems to have opinions about our conversation." Something in Harlan's expression softened at her words. "When are you due?" "Dr. Morrison thinks late September, maybe early October. About 6 weeks." The timeline felt both impossibly long and frighteningly short. long enough to worry about everything that could go wrong, short enough that she wasn't prepared for the reality of caring for an infant while managing a farm. "That's not much time," he observed, echoing her thoughts. "And gold coins won't deliver a baby or help with night feedings." His practical assessment of her situation was both reassuring and unsettling. He wasn't treating her newfound wealth as if it solved all her problems, but he also wasn't pretending she was the same desperate woman he'd first offered to help. "No," she agreed, "they won't." Harlan set his hat on the table and ran his hand through his dark hair, a gesture that made him seem less controlled, more human. "Mrs. Crane, Maybelle, I want to be clear about something. My offer of help was never about charity. It was about respect for what you're trying to accomplish here." The use of her first name sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. They'd been carefully formal with each other, despite the growing intimacy of his involvement in her life. Hearing her name in his deep voice felt like crossing another invisible boundary. "I don't understand the distinction," she said honestly. "Charity is about giving to those who can't help themselves," he explained. "Respect is about supporting people who are already helping themselves, just not getting the results their efforts deserve. Finding that gold doesn't change the fact that you've been working this farm alone while 7 months pregnant. It doesn't change the courage that took." She walked to the window, needing distance to process his words. Outside, Pete and Charlie were still working on the barn roof, their movements efficient and purposeful. They'd continued their work even after learning about the gold, as if her ability to pay them had never been the point. "What are you saying?" she asked without turning around. "I'm saying that if you want to pay the bank and send us all away, I'll respect that decision. But if you'd rather have help from people who understand what you're trying to build here, that offer stands regardless of what's in that box." Maybelle turned to face him, struck by the quiet intensity in his expression. Here was a man who'd achieved success through his own efforts, who understood the difference between assistance and dependence. He wasn't offering to save her. He was offering to stand beside her while she saved herself. From her apron pocket, she withdrew a blue ribbon, faded and worn, but carefully preserved. It was the ribbon Thomas had won at the county fair 3 years ago for the best corn crop in the district. She'd kept it not for its monetary value, but for what it represented, the possibility of excellence, the reward for work well done. "Thomas won this the year before he died," she said, running the silk between her fingers. "He was so proud, not because of the prize money, but because it meant he was becoming the kind of farmer he'd always wanted to be, building something that would last." Harlan watched her handle the ribbon with the reverence it deserved. "He would have been proud of what you're doing now." "I hope so," she said quietly. "But I also hope he'd understand that some things are too big to accomplish alone." The admission cost her something, pride perhaps, or the illusion of complete self-sufficiency. But it also felt like relief, like setting down a burden she'd been carrying for too long. "So what happens now?" Harlan asked. Maybelle looked at the gold coins glinting in their box, then at the man who'd offered help without strings attached, then at the blue ribbon that represented her husband's dreams and her own determination to honor them. "Now I pay the bank," she said firmly. "And then I'd like to discuss what kind of help I might need to get through the winter and ready for spring planting, if you're still willing to offer it." The smile that crossed Harlan's face was small but genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that transformed his entire expression. "I'm willing," he said simply, as thunder rumbled in the distance, promising the storm that had been building all day. Maybelle felt something settle into place inside her chest. She had choices now, real choices, and she was choosing to accept help from a man whose respect meant more to her than his charity ever could have. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke just after sunset, sending Harlan's men scrambling to secure their tools and seek shelter in the barn. Harlan himself had been caught helping to cover the exposed section of roof when the first fat raindrops began to fall, and by the time they reached the house, both he and Maybelle were thoroughly soaked. She handed him a towel from the kitchen. acutely aware of how the wet fabric of his shirt clung to his shoulders and the way droplets of rain caught in his dark hair. There was something intimate about the domesticity of the moment. A man in her kitchen, accepting her hospitality, the storm creating a temporary sanctuary that felt both natural and dangerous. "Coffee?" she offered, busying herself with the familiar ritual to avoid staring at him. "It's yesterday's, but it's hot." "That would be welcome," he said, settling into the chair Thomas used to occupy at the kitchen table. The choice seemed unconscious, but it sent a jolt through her, nonetheless. Thomas's chair, Thomas's place, filled by a man whose presence was beginning to feel essential rather than merely helpful. As she poured coffee into 2 chipped cups, the baby began its evening routine of kicks and stretches, making her pause and press her hand to her side. The child had grown more active in recent weeks, as if sensing the approaching change from the protected world of the womb to the uncertain reality beyond. "Are you all right?" Harlan asked, half rising from his chair with quick concern. "Fine," she assured him, settling into her own chair with careful movements. "The baby just likes to remind me it's there. Dr. Morrison says active babies are healthy babies." Thunder rolled overhead, rattling the windows and making the lamplight flicker. The sound seemed to settle something between them, creating a pocket of warmth and safety that made honest conversation easier. "May I ask you something personal?" Maybelle said, surprising herself with her boldness. Harlan nodded, his grey eyes attentive in the golden light. "Of course. Your wife, Catherine, what was she like?" For a moment she thought he might deflect the question. His face went very still, and his hands tightened slightly around his coffee cup, but when he spoke, his voice was steady, even warm. "She was luminous," he said finally. "That's the word that always comes to mind. Not just beautiful, though she was that, but bright in a way that made everyone around her feel more alive. She had this laugh that could fill a room, and she never met a stray animal or struggling person she didn't want to help." Maybelle watched his face as he spoke, seeing the way memory softened the harsh lines that grief and work had carved there. "She sounds wonderful." "She was," he agreed. "She was also stubborn as a Missouri mule and convinced she could fix anyone's problems through sheer force of will. Sometimes that combination of kindness and determination got her into trouble." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, and Maybelle found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by this glimpse into his past happiness. "What kind of trouble?" "Well, there was the time she decided our cook needed a husband and proceeded to invite every eligible bachelor in 3 counties to dinner until she found one who suited. Poor Mrs. Henderson didn't know whether to be grateful or horrified when Catherine's matchmaking actually worked." Despite herself, Maybelle laughed at the image. "She sounds like she would have been a good friend." "She would have liked you," Harlan said quietly. "She had a deep respect for women who fought for what mattered to them, especially when the odds were stacked against them." The compliment spoken in his wife's memory carried more weight than any praise of his own. Maybelle felt something warm uncurl in her chest. A recognition that she was being measured against a standard of courage and determination rather than mere need or pity. "How long were you married?" she asked. 6 years. We were trying for children almost from the beginning, but it took time. When Catherine finally conceived, we were—" He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to his vest pocket, where she knew he kept his watch. "We were so careful. The best doctors, complete bed rest toward the end, everything money could buy. None of it mattered." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but unmistakable. Maybelle found herself reaching across the table without unconscious thought, covering his hand with hers. The gesture surprised them both, but neither pulled away. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I can't imagine how difficult that must have been." "The worst part," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "was feeling like I'd failed her. Like all my success, all my money, all my planning was worthless when it came to protecting the person I loved most." The confession hung between them, in the storm-darkened kitchen, raw and honest in a way that felt dangerous. Maybelle understood now why he'd been drawn to help her. She represented another woman fighting against impossible odds, another chance to provide the protection he'd been unable to give Catherine. From her pocket, she withdrew the silver locket she'd worn since her wedding day. It was a simple piece, not expensive, but inside was a small photograph of Thomas taken on their wedding day. She opened it and placed it on the table between them. "I understand about failure," she said quietly. "I couldn't save Thomas either. The fever took him so quickly, and there was nothing I could do but watch him slip away. For months afterward, I kept thinking about all the things I should have done differently, all the signs I might have missed." Harlan studied the photograph with respectful attention. "He looks like a good man." He was. But he was also stubborn about asking for help, especially from doctors. He thought admitting weakness was somehow failing me and our future children. If I'd insisted, maybe... She closed the locket with a soft click. But maybe not. Maybe some things just happen regardless of what we do to prevent them. Catherine used to say that grief was love with nowhere to go, Harlan said. That the pain was just proof of how much we'd cared. She was wise. She was. And she would have told me that the best way to honor what we'd lost was to help protect what others were trying to build. He looked directly at Maybelle, his gray eyes serious. "I think that's what I'm trying to do here, not replace what I lost, but use what I learned from losing it." The honesty of the admission took her breath away. Here was a man who'd found a way to transform his grief into something useful, who'd chosen to pour his protective instincts into helping others rather than closing himself off from further pain. "And what have you learned?" she asked. "That love isn't about preventing all harm," he said slowly, as if working out the words as he spoke them. "It's about standing beside someone while they face whatever comes. Catherine didn't need me to save her. She needed me to believe in her strength while she fought her own battles." Thunder crashed overhead again, closer this time, and the baby responded with a particularly vigorous kick that made Maybelle gasp. But when Harlan's eyes dropped to her belly with concern, she didn't feel exposed or embarrassed. Instead, she felt seen in a way that was both frightening and exhilarating. "Would you like to feel?" she heard herself ask, the words escaping before her rational mind could stop them. Harlan's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she thought he might refuse. But then he nodded, rising from his chair and moving around the table with careful deliberation. When she guided his hand to the spot where the baby was most active, his intake of breath was audible. "Strong," he murmured, wonder evident in his voice as the child kicked against his palm. Catherine would have said that's a good sign, babies with fighting spirit. They stayed like that for several heartbeats, his hand warm against her belly, the baby moving restlessly beneath their joined touch. The intimacy of the moment should have felt wrong, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world, two people who'd known loss, sharing hope for new life. When the baby finally settled, Harlan withdrew his hand slowly, but he didn't move away immediately. They were close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his grey eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his still damp shirt. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for letting me share that." The storm was moving away now, the thunder growing more distant, but the intimacy it had created lingered between them like a promise. Whatever was growing between them was more than gratitude, more than shared grief, more than mere attraction. It was recognition. Two souls who'd been shaped by loss but hadn't been broken by it, finding in each other the possibility of building something stronger than either could achieve alone. The letter arrived 3 days after the storm, carried by the same bank clerk who'd delivered the foreclosure notice, though this time his demeanor was notably less officious. Samuel Hartwell dismounted with obvious reluctance, clutching a leather satchel as if it contained something distasteful. "Mrs. Crane," he said, his voice lacking its previous authority, "I have documents here that require your immediate attention, legal matters concerning your late husband's estate that have recently come to light." Maybelle set down the basket of eggs she'd been collecting. a cold dread settling in her stomach despite the warm morning air. She'd paid the bank debt in full just 2 days prior, counting out Thomas's hidden gold with satisfaction that bordered on triumph. What other legal complications could possibly emerge now? What kind of legal matters? She asked, accepting the envelope with hands that wanted to tremble. Hartwell cleared his throat uncomfortably. It appears there were irregularities in your husband's original land purchase. Documents that weren't properly filed, debts that weren't properly disclosed. The bank has been conducting a thorough review of all outstanding accounts, and certain discrepancies have emerged. The envelope contained several pages of dense legal text, but one document stood out immediately, a letter in Thomas's careful handwriting dated just weeks before his death. Her heart began to pound as she recognized his script, and she had to read the first lines twice before their meaning penetrated her shock. My dearest Maybelle, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and my secrets have finally surfaced. I pray you can forgive me for the deception, but I could not bear to burden you with the truth while I lived. The farm we have called home, the land I told you we owned outright, was purchased with money that was not entirely mine to spend. Her hands began to shake in earnest as she continued reading. Hartwell's presence forgotten in the face of Thomas's devastating confession. The original down payment came from my employer in Ohio, money I was supposed to invest in farming equipment for his operation. I convinced myself it was borrowing, that I would pay him back once our crops proved successful. I even forged his signature on documents that made it appear he had agreed to the arrangement. When he discovered the theft, for that is what it was, though I called it by kinder names, I had already married you and moved to Kansas. The world seemed to tilt around her as she read on, each word reshaping everything she thought she knew about their life together. I believed I could make the farm profitable enough to repay what I had stolen and tell you the truth once the debt was satisfied. But the poor harvests, the drought, the constant struggle to make ends meet, none of it allowed for the success I had counted on. The money I saved, the gold hidden in the barn, was meant to pay my old employer and clear my conscience. But now, that task falls to you. His name is Marcus Whitfield, and his farm is outside Zanesville, Ohio. The amount I took was $450. Ironically, almost exactly what you will find hidden in the barn rafters. I had hoped to add to that sum, to pay him with interest for his unwitting loan, but fate has decided otherwise. Maybelle's legs felt weak, and she sank onto the porch steps, the letter fluttering in her trembling hands. Thomas, her honest, hard-working. Thomas had built their entire life on stolen money. Everything they'd shared, every dream they'd planned, was founded on a crime he'd never had the courage to confess. I know this revelation will change how you remember me, and I cannot bear the thought of you learning to hate the memory of our love. But I could not let you unknowingly keep money that rightfully belongs to another man. Marcus Whitfield has a family too, children who deserve the inheritance I stole from them. The choice of what to do with this knowledge is yours now. You could destroy this letter and keep the gold, and no one would be the wiser. But I pray you will choose the path I was too cowardly to take. Return what was stolen and build your future on honest ground, even if it means starting with nothing. I love you beyond words, and I hope someday you can forgive me. Your devoted husband, Thomas Hartwell, cleared his throat again, drawing her attention back to his uncomfortable presence. There's more, I'm afraid. Mr. Whitfield's son came to the bank yesterday with documents proving his father's claim. He's demanding immediate restitution and threatening legal action if the matter isn't resolved promptly. The remaining papers in the envelope detailed Marcus Whitfield's death 6 months after Thomas's theft, leaving behind a widow and 3 children who'd struggled financially ever since. The son, now grown, had spent years tracking down the money. His father had lost, hiring investigators and lawyers who'd finally traced the theft to Thomas Crane and his Kansas farm. What happens if I can't pay? Maybelle asked, though she already knew the answer. The farm would be seized to satisfy the debt, Hartwell replied. Mr. Whitfield's son has made it clear he intends to pursue this matter to its full legal conclusion. After Hartwell left, Maybelle sat alone on her porch. Thomas's letter spread before her like evidence in a trial. The baby moved restlessly within her, as if sensing her distress, and she pressed both hands to her belly in an attempt to calm both of them. The irony was devastating. She'd found the gold, and felt such relief, such vindication of Thomas's love and foresight. Now she learned that the money wasn't salvation. It was evidence of the crime that would destroy everything she'd fought to preserve. The $400 that should have secured her future was already spoken for, already owed to strangers in Ohio who had their own legitimate claim to Thomas's legacy. Worse than the financial reality was the emotional devastation. Thomas, who'd seemed so honest, so principled, had built their marriage on a foundation of theft and lies. Every conversation about their future, every plan they'd made together, had been shadowed by his knowledge of what he'd done. How many nights had he lain beside her, knowing that their happiness was purchased with another family's misfortune? The sound of approaching horses made her look up to see Harlan riding toward the farm, his expression already concerned, though he couldn't yet know what had happened. Behind him rode Jake and the other men, coming to continue their work on projects that now seemed pointless. How could she explain that the woman he'd been helping, the widow he'd been protecting, was actually the unknowing beneficiary of a crime? As Harlan dismounted and approached the porch, she could see him taking in her pale face and trembling hands the scattered legal documents that told their devastating story. When he sat beside her on the steps without waiting for an invitation, his presence felt like both comfort and reproach. "What's happened?" he asked quietly, his grey eyes moving from her face to the papers and back again. She handed him Thomas's letter without speaking, watching his expression change as he read. The disappointment she'd feared to see never materialized. Instead, his face showed something closer to sadness, not for her situation, but for the burden of guilt Thomas had carried alone. "I'm sorry," he said when he finished reading. "This must be devastating news." "He lied to me," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. "Our entire marriage was built on money he stole from another family. Everything I thought I knew about him, about us, was false." Harlan was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon where heat waves already shimmered despite the early hour. When he spoke, his voice was carefully measured. "Was your love for him false? Were the kindness and devotion he showed you false? Was his death any less of a loss because of this mistake?" The question stopped her spiraling thoughts short. "Of course not, but then not everything was false," he said gently. "Thomas made a terrible choice when he was young, and he spent the rest of his life trying to live worthy of what he'd taken. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it doesn't erase who he became either." As if summoned by their conversation, a rider appeared on the horizon. A young man of perhaps 25, well-dressed, and riding with the determined pace of someone on serious business. Even at a distance, there was something familiar about his bearing that made Maybelle's heart sink further. "That'll be Marcus Whitfield's son," she said with grim certainty. "Come to claim his father's money, and probably take satisfaction in watching Thomas's widow lose everything." Harlan's hand found hers where it rested on her knee, his touch warm and steadying. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "you don't have to face it alone." The promise should have comforted her, but as the young man rode closer, Maybelle could think only of the devastating irony that Thomas's attempt to provide for their future had instead guaranteed its destruction. The hidden letter that was supposed to ease his conscience had become the instrument of her ruin, and there was nothing left to do but watch their carefully built world collapse around the truth he'd been too afraid to tell. The young man who, dismounted in Maybelle's yard, had his father's eyes, sharp blue and assessing, but none of the weathered kindness that typically marked farmers who'd worked the land for generations. David Whitfield carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who'd spent years nurturing grievances, and when he approached the porch where Maybelle and Harlan sat, his expression held no sympathy for her condition or circumstances. "Mrs. Thomas Crane," he said without preamble, his voice clipped and businesslike. "I'm David Whitfield. I believe you've received word about my father's claim against this property." Maybelle struggled to rise from the porch steps, her pregnancy making the movement awkward, but Harlan's steady hand on her elbow helped her find her balance. Standing seemed important somehow, a small assertion of dignity in the face of what felt like an execution. "Mr. Whitfield," she replied, pleased that her voice remained steady. "I've read the documents. I'm sorry for your family's loss." David's laugh was sharp and humorless. "My father died a broken man, Mrs. Crane. Your husband's theft cost him not just money but his reputation, his standing in the community, his ability to provide for his family. My mother took in washing to keep food on the table. My younger sister never married because we couldn't afford a proper dowry, so forgive me if your condolences ring hollow." The words hit like physical blows, each detail of the Whitfield family's suffering adding weight to the guilt that was already crushing her chest. These weren't abstract victims. They were real people whose lives had been derailed by Thomas's desperate choice. "I understand your anger," she said quietly, "and you're right to feel it. What my husband did was wrong, regardless of his reasons or intentions." "His reasons?" David's voice rose incredulously. What possible reason could justify stealing from a man who trusted him? Harlan stepped slightly forward, not threateningly, but enough to make his presence felt. "Perhaps we could discuss this more calmly," he suggested. "Mrs. Crane has just learned about her husband's actions. She's as shocked as anyone." David's gaze shifted to Harlan, taking in his expensive clothes and obvious prosperity with obvious resentment. "And you are Harlan Boone, a friend of Mrs. Crane's? A friend with deep pockets, I'm guessing," David said with calculated cruelty. How convenient for the widow to find such generous friendship so soon after her husband's death. The implication made Maybelle's cheeks burn with anger and shame, but before she could respond, a sharp pain lanced across her lower back, so sudden and severe that she gasped and doubled over. Harlan's arm was around her immediately, supporting her weight as the contraction, for that's what it had to be, squeezed her belly like a giant fist. "Maybelle," Harlan said urgently, "what's wrong?" "The baby," she managed to say through gritted teeth. "I think—" Another contraction cut off her words, stronger this time, and she felt a warm wetness between her legs that made her panic spike higher. "Get Dr. Morrison," Harlan ordered Jake, who'd been watching the confrontation from a respectful distance. "Ride hard. Tell him it's urgent." David Whitfield's hostility faltered in the face of medical crisis, his anger giving way to uncomfortable concern. "Is she? Should I leave?" "You should help," Harlan said grimly, lifting Maybelle in, his arms with surprising gentleness. "Or at least stay out of the way while we get her inside." The next hour passed in a haze of increasing pain and mounting fear. The contractions came stronger and more frequently than Dr. Morrison had prepared her to expect, and the blood that stained her dress spoke of complications that could endanger both her and the baby. Harlan stayed beside her bed, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos of medical emergency. Dr. Morrison arrived just as another powerful contraction left her. Sobbing with pain and exhaustion, his weathered face was grim as he examined her, his hands gentle but his expression deeply concerned. "The baby's coming early," he announced, confirming what they all already knew. "And it's not positioned properly. We're going to have to work together to get through this safely." From her bedroom window, she could see David Whitfield pacing. In her yard, his legal documents forgotten in the face of life and death drama, Jake and the other men had withdrawn to the barn, giving them privacy while remaining close enough to help if needed. As another contraction built, threatening to split her in half with its intensity, Maybelle found herself gripping Harlan's hand with desperate strength. His fingers intertwined with hers, steady and warm, offering the kind of support Thomas should have been there to provide. "I can't do this," she gasped between contractions. "It's too early, and if something happens to the baby, you can do this," Harlan said firmly, his grey eyes holding hers with unwavering certainty. "You're the strongest person I know, and this baby is lucky to have you fighting for it." Dr. Morrison's medical bag sat open on her dresser, its contents spread out with clinical efficiency. Instruments gleamed in the afternoon light streaming through her windows, and the sight of them made her stomach clench with terror that had nothing to do with physical pain. She'd heard too many stories of women who didn't survive difficult births, babies who came too early to thrive. "Mrs. Crane," Dr. Morrison said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone doctors used in crisis, "I need you to listen carefully. The baby's breech, which means this is going to take some doing. But I've delivered plenty of breech babies, and most of them turn out just fine. The key is staying calm and working with your body, not fighting against it." Another contraction seized her, and she heard herself cry out despite her determination to stay strong. Through the window, she could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon, the same kind of weather pattern that had brought Harlan to her kitchen just days ago. It seemed fitting that this baby would arrive amid thunder and lightning, born into a world as turbulent as the circumstances of its conception. "Harlan," she managed to say during a brief respite between contractions, "if something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," he interrupted fiercely. "I won't let it." The promise was impossible to keep, of course. Money and determination couldn't prevent the complications that took women in childbirth, couldn't guarantee safe delivery when babies came too early. But his certainty gave her something to hold on to when the next wave of pain threatened to sweep away her courage entirely. As thunder began to roll across the Kansas sky, Maybelle closed her eyes and tried to find the strength that everyone seemed to believe she possessed. Somewhere in her yard, a man waited to claim everything she'd fought to preserve. In her bed, she battled to bring new life safely into a world that had already proven itself full of unexpected cruelties and undeserved hardships. But Harlan's hand remained steady in hers. Dr. Morrison's voice stayed calm and professional. And, despite everything that had gone wrong, she wasn't facing this crisis alone. Thomas had left her more than stolen gold and guilty secrets. He'd left her with the capacity to accept help when she needed it most, to recognize that some battles required more than one person's strength to win. The baby moved restlessly within her as another contraction began to build, and Maybelle held tight to Harlan's hand and prepared to fight for the future with everything she had left. The voices from the yard had grown louder and more argumentative by the time Dr. Morrison declared Maybelle stable enough to be left with careful supervision. Baby Grace slept peacefully in the cradle Thomas had carved, seemingly oblivious to the storm raging both outside and in the heated discussion taking place beneath her mother's windows. "I should go deal with this," Harlan said quietly, his jaw set with determination. "You need rest, and Grace needs quiet. Whatever they think they're here to accomplish can wait." But before he could leave the bedroom, Marcus Crane's voice carried clearly through the rain, raised in anger and accusation. "That baby doesn't change anything. She's still got no legal right to this property, especially now that the truth about Thomas's thievery has come out." Maybelle's blood ran cold at the revelation that Marcus somehow knew about the stolen money. The secret Thomas had carried to his grave was apparently spreading through the community like wildfire, turning her from a sympathetic widow into the beneficiary of criminal enterprise. "How did he find out?" she whispered, clutching Grace closer to her chest. Jake appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Word travels fast in small communities, especially bad news. David Whitfield's been talking to anyone who'll listen about his father's claim." Seems Marcus heard the story and decided it was his chance to finally get this land. Through the window, Maybelle could see the confrontation in her yard. Marcus Crane stood toe-to-toe with David Whitfield, both men gesturing angrily, while a thin, well-dressed stranger, presumably Marcus's lawyer, tried to maintain some semblance of legal decorum. The rain had soaked them all, but none seemed inclined to seek shelter, while matters of money and property remained unsettled. "What does Marcus want?" Maybelle asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The farm," Jake replied bluntly. "He's claiming that since Thomas acquired it through theft, you have no legal right to it. Says it should revert to the family, meaning him, since he's the only surviving male heir." The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. Thomas had stolen money to buy land for their future children, and now those very crimes were being used to deprive his actual child of her inheritance. Grace stirred in her arms, making soft baby sounds that seemed to underscore the stakes of what was happening outside. Harlan had moved to the window, his hands braced against the sill as he watched the argument below. "They're circling like vultures," he said quietly. "3 different claims on the same property, and none of them particularly concerned about a woman who just gave birth." From her dresser drawer, Maybelle could see the corner of a document she'd almost forgotten. The blank marriage certificate that Reverend Walsh had left with her weeks ago, suggesting she might want to consider her options for the baby's future. At the time, it had seemed presumptuous, even insulting. Now it represented something else entirely. A choice between conventional expectations and authentic partnership. "Harlan," she said quietly, "would you bring me that paper from the top drawer, the one with the church seal?" He retrieved the marriage certificate with puzzled compliance, his grey eyes questioning as he handed it to her. The document was simple but official, requiring only signatures and a witness to create a legal union recognized by both church and state. "What are you thinking?" he asked, though something in his expression suggested he was beginning to understand. "I'm thinking that Grace needs protection, and I need a partner who understands what we're fighting for," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm thinking that sometimes the most practical choice is also the most honest one." The baby chose that moment to wake, opening her eyes and looking around with the unfocused awareness of the newborn. When her gaze seemed to settle on Harlan's face, he smiled with such tenderness that Maybelle felt her heart constrict with recognition. "Are you proposing to me, Mrs. Crane?" he asked softly, his tone carrying both surprise and something that might have been hope. "I'm suggesting that 2 people who understand loss and aren't afraid of hard work might do better together than apart," she replied. "I'm suggesting that Grace deserves parents who choose each other deliberately, not just circumstances that throw them together." Outside, the argument had escalated further, with Marcus now shouting about justice and family rights, while David Whitfield insisted that his father's claim superseded any familial considerations. The lawyer was taking notes, presumably calculating billable hours, while the men destroyed each other's arguments with increasing fury. "What about love?" Harlan asked quietly, his question cutting through the external chaos to the heart of what mattered. Maybelle looked at him, really looked, taking in the exhaustion lines around his eyes from staying by her side through the difficult birth, the gentle way he'd spoken to Grace, the steady strength he'd offered without asking for anything in return. Love came in many forms, and she was beginning to understand that the most enduring kind grew from respect and shared purpose rather than mere passion. "I think love is what you build together, not just what you feel in the beginning," she said carefully. "I think it's what happens when 2 people decide to face the world as partners instead of facing it alone." Grace made a soft cooing sound, as if offering her own opinion on the matter, and both adults smiled, despite the gravity of their situation. Through the window, they could see that the 3 men had now moved their argument to the porch, presumably seeking shelter from the rain while they continued to debate the disposition of property that belonged to none of them. "They can argue all they want," Harlan said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "But if you're willing to marry me, Maybelle, then Grace has a father who can protect what's hers." And you have a husband who understands that some things are worth fighting for. The certificate lay between them on the bed, crisp and official, waiting for signatures that would change everything. Maybelle thought of Thomas, of the guilt he'd carried, and the love he'd shown, despite his failures. She thought of Catherine, whose memory had shaped Harlan into a man capable of protecting without possessing. Most of all, she thought of Grace, sleeping peacefully while strangers argued over her birthright. "Dr. Morrison can serve as witness," she said, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. "And Jake, if he's willing. A marriage performed under these circumstances will be legal and binding, which should complicate their legal arguments considerably." Harlan's smile was slow but genuine, transforming his weathered features into something approaching joy. "Mrs. Boone has a nice sound to it," he said quietly. "And Grace Catherine Boone will have a name that carries weight in this county." As thunder crashed overhead and the voices from the porch grew more heated, Maybelle felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. She was about to marry a man she'd known for weeks rather than years, but she was also choosing a partner who'd proven his character through actions rather than words. Sometimes the most important decisions were the ones that felt both inevitable and surprising at the same time. "Let's get married," she said simply, and watched Harlan's face light up with something that looked very much like the beginning of love. The impromptu wedding took place in Maybelle's bedroom, with Grace sleeping peacefully in her cradle and rain, drumming against the windows like nature's own processional music. Dr. Morrison, still present to monitor both mother and baby, agreed to serve as officiant with the authority granted him as a county health officer, while Jake stood witness with his hat respectfully in hand. Harlan had cleaned himself up as best he could, finger-combing his rain-dampened hair and straightening his shirt, but there was nothing conventional about the ceremony. Maybelle sat propped against her pillows, still pale from childbirth but determined to see this through, while her new husband knelt beside the bed to place the simple gold band, his own wedding ring which he'd continued wearing in Catherine's. Memory on her finger. "I can't promise you'll never face hardship," he said quietly, his grey eyes serious as he spoke the vows they'd agreed upon. "But I can promise you'll never face it alone. I can't promise to be the wife Catherine was," Maybelle replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were undertaking. "But I can promise to be the partner you need and the mother Grace deserves." Dr. Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, just as the argument on the porch reached its crescendo, the timing creating an almost comical contrast between the quiet dignity of their union and the ugly dispute taking place below. When Jake opened the bedroom door to invite the antagonists inside for what would undoubtedly be a heated confrontation, the three men were soaked, angry, and unprepared for what they were about to discover. Marcus Crane entered first, his face flushed with righteous indignation and rainwater dripping from his coat. Behind him came David Whitfield, clutching his legal documents like weapons, and finally the thin lawyer, whose expensive clothes looked considerably less impressive after their soaking. "Maybelle," Marcus began without preamble, "we need to discuss the disposition of this property now that the truth about Thomas's crimes has—" He stopped short when he noticed Harlan's proprietary position beside the bed, and his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What's he doing here?" "Mr. Boone is my husband," Maybelle replied calmly, holding up her left hand to display the wedding ring that had, moments earlier, belonged to another woman but now symbolized her new life. "We were just married." The silence that followed was pregnant with shock and calculation. Marcus's face went through several shades of red as he processed the implications, while David Whitfield looked between his legal documents and the newly married couple with obvious confusion. "That's impossible," Marcus sputtered. "You can't. Just, Thomas has been dead less than a year. There are proprieties, legal considerations. The marriage is perfectly legal," Dr. Morrison interjected with professional authority. "I performed the ceremony myself, with proper witnesses and documentation. Mrs. Boone is now under her husband's protection and legal authority." The lawyer, a man named Henley, according to his earlier introduction, cleared his throat nervously. This does complicate matters considerably. Under Kansas law, a married woman's property rights are governed by her husband's legal standing, and Mr. Boone's reputation and assets would provide significant protection against most claims. David Whitfield's face had gone pale as he realized. His carefully planned legal assault had just encountered an unexpected obstacle. "This doesn't change the fundamental facts," he insisted. "The money was still stolen from my father. The debt still exists." "The debt exists," Harlan agreed quietly, rising to his full height and somehow managing to make the cramped bedroom feel like his domain. "And it will be paid. Every penny your father was owed, with interest calculated from the date of the original theft." The unexpected offer of full restitution clearly caught David off guard. He'd been prepared for denial, legal maneuvering, or desperate attempts to avoid payment. He hadn't expected a wealthy rancher to simply promise complete satisfaction of the debt. "You're willing to pay $450 plus interest?" he asked incredulously. "I'm willing to pay whatever is legally and morally owed," Harlan replied. "But in return, I expect a full legal release of any claims against this property and a written acknowledgement that the debt is satisfied in full." Marcus had been growing increasingly agitated during this exchange, recognizing that his opportunity to claim the farm was slipping away. "You can't just buy your way out of this," he protested. "Thomas committed a crime, and there should be consequences." "The consequences are being paid," Harlan interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made strong men reconsider their positions. "Mr. Whitfield will receive full compensation for his father's loss. Justice will be served. What more do you want?" "I want what's rightfully mine," Marcus exploded. "This farm should have come to family, not to some stranger who happened to catch my brother's widow in a weak moment." The crude implication made Jake stiffen visibly, and Harlan's expression went dangerously cold. But before either man could respond, Maybelle's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Get out," she said quietly, but with such firm authority that even Marcus fell silent. "Get out of my house, away from my property, and don't come back. You have no claim here, legal or moral, and you're not welcome." Grace chose that moment to wake and begin crying, her infant voice adding urgency to an already charged situation. The sound seemed to remind everyone present that they were arguing over the future of a newborn child, not just abstract property rights. Harlan moved to the cradle and lifted Grace with surprising gentleness, cradling her against his chest until her cries subsided into soft murmurs. The sight of the wealthy rancher comforting the baby created a picture of family unity that was both touching and strategically powerful. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite Grace's presence, "I suggest we conclude our business quickly and peacefully. Mrs. Boone has just given birth and needs rest. Her daughter needs quiet. And frankly, your continued presence is disturbing the peace of my family." The word family seemed to resonate through the room, transforming the dynamics of the confrontation. This was no longer about a vulnerable widow and her illegitimate claims. This was about a prosperous rancher protecting his wife and child from harassment. David Whitfield was the first to recognize the new reality. "If you're serious about full payment," he said to Harlan, "then I'm willing to settle this matter immediately. My father deserves justice, but he also deserves to have his family's honor restored by having the debt properly satisfied. I'll have my banker in Lawrence prepare a draft for the full amount plus reasonable interest," Harlan replied. $500 should more than cover the obligation. "And I'll prepare the legal releases," Lawyer Henley added, sensing an opportunity to conclude profitable business. Full satisfaction of all claims, properly documented and filed with the county. Marcus had been growing increasingly isolated as his supposed allies abandoned his cause for practical settlements. "This isn't over," he said venomously, but his words carried the hollow ring of impotent anger. "I'll find another way to challenge this farce." No, Harlan said simply. You won't. Because any further harassment of my family will result in legal action for interference with lawful property rights, and I have considerably more resources for extended litigation than you do. The threat was delivered calmly, almost conversationally, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. Marcus looked around the room, seeking support that was no longer there, then turned and stalked out without another word. As the sound of his retreating footsteps faded, Maybelle felt something release in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying for months without fully realizing it. Grace gurgled contentedly in Harlan's arms, and for the first time since Thomas's death, the future looked like something to anticipate rather than endure. Is it really over? She asked quietly. Harlan returned Grace to her cradle and sat beside Maybelle on the bed, taking her hand in his larger one. The legal troubles are over, he said. Now we get to focus on the more important work of building something together. Through the window she could see David Whitfield and the lawyer riding. Away, their business concluded to everyone's satisfaction. The storm was passing too, leaving behind the clean smell of rain-washed earth and the promise of clearer skies ahead. 6 months later, as spring painted the Kansas prairie in shades of green hope and yellow promise, Maybelle stood on the wide porch of the Double B ranch house, watching her husband teach their daughter to recognize the sound of horses returning home. Grace, now sitting steadily and showing the sturdy determination that seemed to be her defining characteristic, clapped her hands with delight each time Harlan pointed toward the horizon and announced, "Here come the riders." The ranch house was everything the little cabin had not been. Spacious, well-built, designed for comfort rather than mere survival. But Maybelle had insisted on bringing certain treasures from their old life. Thomas's hand-carved cradle, now converted to a toy box where Grace's few possessions lived in organized chaos. The pressed flower from her wedding bouquet, now framed and hanging in the nursery as a reminder that some beautiful things endure against all odds. And the blue ribbon Thomas had won at the county fair, displayed in the kitchen where it caught. The morning light and spoke of excellence achieved through honest work. The legal complications that had once threatened to destroy them were now nothing but paperwork filed away in Harlan's study. David Whitfield had taken his settlement money and returned to Ohio, where he'd used it to expand his own farming operation. His final letter, received just last week, had been surprisingly gracious, expressing hope that Grace would grow up knowing the value of honest work and the importance of making amends when mistakes were made. Marcus Crane had made one final attempt to challenge their marriage through the courts, claiming fraud and coercion, but his case had been dismissed with prejudice, when no evidence could be found to support his allegations. The humiliation had apparently convinced him to relocate to Colorado, where distant cousins offered him work and the chance to rebuild his reputation far from the scene of his failures. The farm itself had been leased to a young couple from Missouri, the Hendricks family, who'd arrived with 3 small children and the kind of determined optimism that reminded Maybelle of herself and Thomas in their early years. She visited occasionally, finding comfort in seeing the land productive again, the cabin filled with laughter, the fields green with crops that would actually make it to harvest. "She's going to be a horsewoman," Harlan observed, settling beside Maybelle on the porch swing he'd built for her comfort during the final weeks of winter. "Look how she watches the horses, studies their movement. She'll be riding before she's walking properly." Grace was indeed fascinated by the horses, turning her head to follow their movement with the focused attention of someone already planning her interaction with these magnificent creatures. At 6 months, she showed no fear of the large animals, reaching toward them with the confidence of a child born into a world where such things were natural and safe. Her father would have loved that, Maybelle said softly, still able to speak of Thomas with affection rather than bitterness. Time and Harlan's gentle understanding had helped her separate the man she'd loved from the mistakes he'd made, allowing her to honor the good while acknowledging the complicated reality of human nature. Both her fathers would love it, Harlan corrected gently, a distinction he'd established early in their marriage. He'd never tried to replace Thomas in Grace's heritage, instead positioning himself as the father who would raise her while honoring the father who had given her life. The photograph that proved this commitment sat on the mantel in their living room, a formal family portrait taken just last month, showing Harlan and Maybelle with Grace between them, but also including a small framed image of Thomas, positioned where it was clearly part of the family group. The photographer had been initially confused by the arrangement, but Harlan had insisted on it, declaring that their family history included everyone who had contributed to their happiness. "Mrs. Patterson stopped by yesterday while you were in town," Maybelle mentioned, shifting Grace to a more comfortable position on her lap. "She wanted to ask if we'd be willing to host the church social this fall. Apparently, the ranch house is now considered one of the finest entertainment venues in the county." Harlan chuckled at the social politics involved in the invitation. 6 months ago, they wouldn't have trusted you to contribute a dish to the social. Now they want to hold it in our parlor. "Things change," Maybelle replied philosophically. "People change, sometimes for the better." It was true in more ways than she'd expected. Her relationship with the community had indeed transformed, but more importantly, her understanding of herself had evolved as well. The woman who'd once been terrified of accepting help now found satisfaction in offering it to others. Just last week, she'd organized a group of ranch wives to assist a new widow whose husband had been killed in a farming accident. The irony of the situation hadn't been lost on her, but it had felt like completing a circle, using what she'd learned from receiving kindness to extend it to someone else in need. Jake mentioned that the Hendricks boy has been asking about working here. "Next summer," Harlan said, referring to the 12-year-old son of the family leasing their old farm. "He's got good instincts with horses, and he reminds me of myself at that age, eager to learn and not afraid of hard work." The casual mention of future plans, of summers that would come, and boys who would grow into men under their guidance, filled Maybelle with contentment. This was what Thomas had dreamed of when he'd carved Grace's cradle, not just a family, but a legacy that would extend beyond their own lives to touch others. Grace began to fuss as the afternoon grew warm, and Maybelle rose to take her inside for a feeding and nap. As she passed through the living room, she paused before the new family photograph, studying the faces that told the story of love found in unexpected places. The woman in the picture looked confident and content, holding her daughter with the easy assurance of someone who knew her place in the world. Beside her stood a man whose grey eyes reflected both the pain of loss and the joy of new beginnings, his hand resting protectively on his wife's shoulder. And between them sat Grace Catherine Boone, 6 months old, and clearly the center of her parents' universe. Her future as bright as the Kansas sky that stretched endlessly beyond the frame. As Maybelle settled into the rocking chair in the nursery, the same chair Thomas had made for her in their little cabin, she thought about the strange path that had led her to this moment. If someone had told her a year ago that she'd be married to Harlan Boone, living in the finest house in the county and raising her daughter in comfort and security, she'd have thought them mad. But here she was, and here Grace was, and here was Harlan humming softly as he went about his afternoon chores with the satisfaction of a man who'd found his purpose. The pressed flower from her first wedding still retained its shape and color, a reminder that some things lasted longer than seemed possible. But it was the new photograph that captured the truth of her current life, that sometimes the most beautiful families were the ones that grew from choice rather than chance, from deliberate commitment rather than simple circumstance. Grace fell asleep in her arms as the afternoon light slanted through the nursery windows, painting everything in golden tones that spoke of abundance and peace. Outside, She could hear Harlan talking to his horses, his voice carrying the contentment of a man who'd learned to build happiness on the foundation of loss, rather than in spite of it. The future stretched ahead of them like the Kansas horizon, vast, full of possibility, and bright with the promise of seasons yet to come. And Grace Catherine Boone, born in a storm but raised in sunshine, would grow up knowing that she was loved not just by the parents who raised her, but by the entire community that had watched her first breath change everything for the better. In the distance, thunder rumbled softly, promising the gentle rain that would nourish the spring crops and fill the streams that fed the endless prairie. But this time, the sound held no threat, only the promise of growth and renewal that came with each turning season. The storm had passed, leaving behind the most precious gift of all, the knowledge that love, like the Kansas earth itself, was strong enough to weather any hardship and still bring forth new life when the time was right.